My name is James Robson, and I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard University Asia Center. And I wanted to welcome everyone to this Director's Conversation as part of our virtual program series at the Asia Center. And today we're very lucky to have Bina Lakshmi Nepram, who is currently a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University, to join us today for this conversation. Bina is an Indigenous scholar and human rights defender whose work focuses on deepening democracy and championing women-led peace, security, and disarmament in Manipur, which is located in Northeast India, and also does work throughout South Asia. She is the founder of three organizations: the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network, the Control Arms Foundation of India, and the Global Alliance of Indigenous Peoples, Gender Justice, and Peace. She has been very active in different initiatives throughout Northeast India and also throughout South Asia more generally. She's the author of 5 books, including Deepening Democracy, Diversity and Women's Rights in India, published in 2019, Where Are Women in Decision Making, published in 2016, and also South Asia's Fractured Frontier, published in 2002. And she's also been the recipient of a number of international awards and recognitions, including the CNN IBN Real Heroes Award in 2011. And she's also been very active in representing and speaking about this region at the United Nations in both Geneva and New York City. And her work engages with global multilateral bodies in an effort to bring peace and justice in her home state of Manipur in Northeast India, and which is a region, as we'll learn today, that has been racked by a long-running armed conflict and has been subjected to martial law since 1958. So I'd like to welcome Bina today and thank her very much for joining me in this discussion. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, James. It's such a pleasure to be here with you for this Director's Conversation hosted by the Asia Center.
So I thought it might be useful for our listeners and viewers if we could begin first with having you describe a little bit the area of Northeast India where your work is focused, and particularly the area where you're from in Manipur. You know, I think that for most of our listeners that people will be familiar with some of the names from the surrounding area there, names like Darjeeling and Assam, have a kind of international recognition. But it's such a fascinating geographic place just in its location, and also geopolitically, I think, very important area because it's surrounded literally by 5 different countries in close proximity there, with China on one side, Burma or Myanmar on one side, Bhutan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, all encircling this area. So if you could begin with just a kind of description and perhaps a little bit of the background history of this region, that would be, I think, a really wonderful place to begin.
Absolutely. The part of India that I come from is not in the textbooks of India. It's not in the curriculum of India. So it doesn't exist in the consciousness of our country and also internationally. So I really thank your center for hosting me today. And let me describe the region that I come from. I have to warn that it's a National Geographer's paradise. This is a part of the world which is so diverse, home to 272 indigenous communities, 45 million people living here. And there are 8 states which constitute what is known as the northeast of India: Manipur, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Sikkim, Tripura, Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, and all of that. And so 8 different states which constitute the northeast of India. And as you rightly said, we share only 2% border with India. And 98% of northeast of India shares border with 5 countries. For example, Sikkim, a beautiful state which joined the Union of India in 1975, it borders, Tibet, China, there. And then we have Bhutan, and then we have Assam, which borders Bhutan and also Bangladesh. We have Manipur and Nagaland, which borders Myanmar, Arunachal too, and then Mizoram. So it's really a geostrategic area. It is joined to India by just what is called Chicken Neck Corridor, which is 22 kilometers, 12 miles or something like that. So it's a very, very unique location which borders 5 different nations. Now, these parts of these were home to 4 Asiatic nation states. That's one thing that the world and India doesn't even know about, that this is home, usually the notion of the Northeast as a direction. Everyone in this region in India knows us as the Northeast, or they give a term to us, Chinkies, people with small Chinese eyes or something like that. Very racially distinct, derogatory terms given to this community because this region is one of the least understood parts of South Asia and of Asia. And what is happening here, which the world doesn't know, is it's home to one of the world's oldest running armed conflicts. And as a result, more than 50,000 people have died in this part of the world. We have a martial law, as you mentioned. Usually the world thinks of India as the world's largest democracy, but many of us were born and raised in the northeast of India. We know how we have survived. I mean, the day I was born, there was military curfew. My niece died in one of the bomb blasts in the region. Every single family in the Northeast have someone whose families have died, disappeared, or killed. So this is one of the most. It's so ironical that the Northeast of many parts of the world, whether it's Sri Lanka or India, they are really beautiful. So, but it is also riddled with conflict. But at the same time, as I mentioned, these were independent Asiatic nation states. For example, Manipur has its own constitution even before India had its. That's the region that I'm talking about. And as you mentioned, on the beautiful side, as you said, if you have enjoyed Earl Grey tea or English breakfast tea, it comes from Assam. And resource rich also. It's a very rich biodiversity hotspot. We have so many medicinal herbs in this part of the world. The first oil of India was dug not in Mumbai, but in Digboy in Assam. And we have uranium, we have so many natural resources which are so rich in this particular part of the world. So this is a snapshot. It has lots of green valleys, beautiful blue mountains, and you must come and visit us someday.
Seems just an incredible natural beauty, but also just a cultural beauty too. Bright sort of woven fabrics and all kinds of the imagery that I've seen from the region is really quite unique and very special, which makes it all the more shocking to realize the kind of sort of darker history that underlies all of that you've been alluding to here. And so you mentioned the Longarm Conflict and also some of the other issues that have been going on now since the 1950s, from 1958. So I was, clearly you're a product of this, both sides of this region, in the sense culturally, but also a product of the conflicts that have been happening there. So I wonder, perhaps you could introduce a little bit of how you started your work that is more on disarmament issues, nonviolence, and the more activist side of your work as well, and describe how you came to that and what you've been doing recently in that regard.
Absolutely. So as I described to you, this area that I was born in, Manipur, in northeast of India, is one of the world's worst militarized, weaponized zone. And how can I describe this? Imagine you cannot, before, like the lockdowns that we have seen in COVID, we have seen so many multiple lockdowns in our life, much before COVID, where for 100 days we couldn't go to school. For a Manipuri, we don't know what is nightlife. Our life stops, all our meetings stops at 4 o'clock. In the night, only the military insurgents and the street dogs move. There's an element of fear, is how I grew up in this particular part of the world. As I mentioned, you may ask why there is so much of conflict. The reason is because of this political way in which many parts of this region were joined with India. For example, the conflict in Manipur started in 1949, when Manipur was merged under duress. In fact, Shillong Times in their front page in 1949 said Manipur was annexed by India. at that time. So there is a political, the way in which many of these beautiful Asiatic nation states in this part of the world was joined under duress it resulted in many of these entrenched armed conflicts. But there were also other reasons of why the armed conflict happened with the Nagas, also with the Assamese people, with the Mizo people, and the Tripura, people of Tripura. It has many dimensions of migrations. It has element of fear of being inundated in their own land. The Mizo conflict started because of a famine, fear of famine. So there are different layers of it, but two distinct political, violence erupted in the Naga Hills as well as in Manipur state because of the way in which it was joined under India under duress. Now, so as a result, even before I was born, for like the conflict which started as early as 1940s, continued, and India, as I mentioned, imposed a martial law since 1958 and continues in our region in the Northeast till today as I speak. So India is the only country in the world which doesn't have a war, but is an emergency law like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which give right to any Indian soldier, military, armed force personnel to shoot at sight anyone who suspect. You can come to our house anytime and arrest, torture, kill, rape anyone, and we cannot even go to courts of law. This is the level in which our human rights have been constantly trampled upon and violated. For me as a young child growing up in this region, when a child grows up in such a deeply conflict area, for those of us who did not know which is peace, I thought it was normal to grow up. In fact, I wanted to be a physicist. I was dreaming of becoming a physicist. In Manipur, when I was growing up, at that time, studied all my life in Manipur. But then I came to Delhi for my higher studies to pursue my physics honors. So what happened was the distance between Manipur and Delhi made me understand something else wrong was going on. This is my first political consciousness, that when you go far away from home, home becomes closer to you. And this is exactly what happened with me. So I wanted to be a physicist. I launched myself in the path, studied all of that, mathematics, chemistry, all of that. But then as I was sharing what is happening in Manipur with my friends in Delhi, they couldn't believe what I was telling. In fact, they told that what I was telling it was from a film, not from a real life. It was when I realized I grew up, something else is happening. And it hit me very hard that it was a war zone that I grew up in. So I left science and actually turned into a historian in which I documented the origin of conflict in this part of the world. Why did the conflict start? And I also realized that there was so much of arms proliferation. It was not just conflict, because conflict exists in our minds, in our communities, in our nations. What we eat today, what we wear today, these are all little conflicts in life. It's a part of life. But when conflict becomes entrenched and with heavy militarization, weaponization, what it does is it affects the mind, it affects our present, our future, and this is exactly where I stepped in. From that time after I started researching and writing, I understood what was happening, that the violent situation in the northeast of India was then used by gun runners, arms traffickers, and drug traffickers to actually deaden the area with more violence that you could ever imagine. So I started massive research. I went backpacking all across the Indo-Burma border with a lot of youth groups, and I found out weapons from 58 type of weapons flooding Manipur and northeast of India, which includes American M16. America may have never heard of Manipur, but its M16s were already used in our territories. So this is how I realized what I call the tools of conflict and understanding the political conflict. But I also realized that what the political conflict of the people of Manipur with India or the Nagas with India, what was happening was it was then later turned, because there's so many indigenous groups, that powerful forces also started dividing us. So it's evolved a phenomenon called a war within a war phenomena, in which hills and valleys were divided. Nagas and Meiteis were divided. Kukis and Nagas, were divided. And then there was so much of division that I call it, it's like brothers against brothers, sisters against sisters, community against community. So I started seeing the proliferation of armed insurgencies, which was also supported by intelligence groups. So it was so shocking, and how these forces were used in our electoral politics. So when I saw this whole range of what started as a genuine political movement into the criminalization of our democracy, that's when we started the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network to help women survivors of the conflict. And also because gender is so much neglected from our politics, from our decision making, that we started working with marginalized communities, particularly women, indigenous, and minority communities, to ensure that we are on the negotiating table. That's how our work started, from understanding conflict to defining tools of conflict, looking at sort of arms proliferation in the area, which is about disarmament. So we are known for our work on disarmament internationally. In fact, we have done so much work on this. We have presented papers at the UN. We have been on so many UN forums, sharing what is happening in Manipur, can happen in Rwanda, can happen in any other parts of the world. So this is how we have journeyed from Manipur to an international level of looking at, conflict, arms proliferation, and women in decision making.
So maybe you could say a little bit more about that too. I was very glad to hear you bring up the gender element of this, which is really quite troubling in many ways, because on the one hand you have the marginalization of women and the voice of women locally in terms of, say, politics and decision making and things, but then you also have, it seems to me, the main majority of the activists working for peace and disarmament, both locally and at the international level, like yourself, but even locally, are primarily strong women leaders. So could you mention, how did that begin as a kind of a movement there?
Absolutely. This is such a beautiful point. And this is something which I would love to bring to your audience here. And here it goes. The Manipur and Northeast of India, we have over 104-year-old women's movement. For us, Me Too movement started almost a century ago. Manipur was, British rule came to Manipur in 1891. The colonial rule came at that time. So the way we have one of the most extraordinary women's movement that the world has ever seen. It's only that the world doesn't know about us, because our story, one of the thing is, before I jump into this, for example, if you come today, once the pandemic is over, with an Indian visa, you are not easily allowed in our territories. You need what is called an inner line permit or a restricted area permit to enter the northeast of India, many parts of northeast of India. And as a result, this region has been locked out by the government of India from the rest of the world. New York Times tried to enter Manipur in 1980s, and they've been not allowed till today. So, and no humanitarian aid agencies have been allowed in these territories. So people don't know about this region. As a result, this extraordinary century-year-old women's movement continues. Again, our resistance and resilience have also, this story has not been told. So thank you for asking this question, and I'll explain. So our first, the way in which this strong women and gender aspect of our struggle came, as I mentioned, in 1904, against the British colonial rule, in which, when the British government, that time colonial government, tried to recruit the Manipuri indigenous men to do forced labor, the Manipuri women realized that British soldiers don't touch women's bodies. So when they tried to forcibly recruit the men, the women formed a body of wall and physically tussled to ensure that they negotiate, to say that we are not your slaves. Pay us if you want us to work for you. So very strong kind of negotiation as early as 1904. And this experience was translated years later in 1939. In Manipur and the Northeast, we have a very unique of places where what is called Imakai tales, or women's markets, which you've seen recently, a photo essay in New York Times. What happened? This is centuries years old women's markets, where women can convene in a matter of seconds, in hundreds and thousands. So the women's markets of Manipur became the epicenter of women protest origins. So in 1939, when the British realized at that time, because Manipur is a part of a very rich rice producing belt of Asia, from there till Yunnan province, it's historically very famous as origins of rice cultivation. We have rice called, chakhao, which is lilac rice. You must taste someday. It's so good. A very special rice. And so the Marwari community, which is the business class community of India, and the British were siphoning Manipuri rice away for production, for export, creating an artificial food scarcity. So the women of Manipur physically turned the cards upside down to prevent the rice from being taken away, and negotiated with the British government as well as the Manipur king and whatever at the time was, to ensure that our children do not starve at the time. These two phenomena of 1904 and 1939 is known as the First and Second Women's War of Manipur. So today, if you come to Manipur, we have a beautiful stone statue of what is called Nupi Lal Memorial, Women's War Memorial. Again, these movements, even though the word war is used, these were non-violent, strong resistance by the indigenous women of Manipur, which was extraordinary in those times. And then when insurgency started rising, and when India was putting the military, and so many young people were arrested in the middle of the night, the women of Manipur took cue from these historical moments and then started patrolling the streets of Manipur at night with bamboo torches, which is called Maira Paibi, women with bamboo torches. So this is how this extraordinary. So today, if you come to Manipur, we have in every locality of Manipur, humble bamboo huts, which are there. So women take turns at night to stay in those bamboo huts. And if they see an army convoy coming, they take the stone, do the clanging sound at the lamppost, and hundreds converge to physically tussle with the Indian military, paramilitary, to take the boy or girl away from being taken into military vehicle before their families, because once they're picked up, we haven't even got many of the dead bodies of our children to have a proper burial or a cremation in our part of the world. So this is the kind of resistance and resilience which happened. And then our generation, followed this. And I have worked so much closely with some of these extraordinary Maira Paibi women leaders. And I've been so inspiring that the source of our work and our activism stems from this 100-year-old historical movement, which has been going on from 1904 till today. So we started mapping, so we conducted research, writing, so because we are the new generation, so our activism is informed by a very strong research. I love scholarship, and I'm a scholar all my life, literally. So, we did our scholarship. We wrote books on what is happening. That's how, on why this conflict and the weaponization of the region, the women's movement, and my findings, my MPhil thesis is now published into a book called South Asia's Fractured Frontier. So that's how we have navigated from experience at the grassroots till where we are. And then we realized that because 3 to 4 Manipuris were shot every day, like in the 1990s, in the 2000s, there were so many killings that every day we hear 3 to 4 Manipuris shot dead. So we have at the moment 20,000 registered widows of violence. And this is the official data. Our unofficial data, our analysis is there are 3 times more families who have been bereaved in this conflict. So the humanitarian.
So what are sorry to interrupt for a minute, but just so what are the justifications for those, or the explanations for those 3 to 4 killings per day? Are these people labeled as separatists, or are they sort of upstart type connected with other types of crime, or how do they explain those?
Yes. There is a fantastic Human Rights Watch document whose title goes like this: "These fellows must be eliminated." This statement was said by the former Manipur police chief. In short, because of the martial law, this is a very critical point, James. Because of the martial law, everyone in Manipur is a suspect. Even an unborn child is a suspect. This is the pain that the people of Manipur and Northeast feel every single day of our life. That we, the people of Manipur and Northeast, do not feel that our right to life is protected by the Constitution of India, because this martial law takes right to life away. And that is why 3 to 4, what I call slow genocide. It is not like in Rwanda, where in 3 months, millions were slaughtered. Here in the northeast of India, 3 to 4 in Manipur, Manipuris are killed every day. This is the reason why we, through our research, when we found out this, we realized that's why the name of our organization is Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network. And many of these killings were done by guns. They were not, so that's why we wanted to bring home the point. And this is why everyone, including, I'm a suspect in the eyes of, like, as long as you have the martial law, everyone is a suspect. The 2.2 million Manipuris are all suspect in the eyes of law because of this martial law. And that's why for more than 16 years, a brave Manipuri woman, Irom Sharmila, fasted for 16 long years asking for the removal of this martial law. The mothers of Manipur, Maira Paibis, protested year after year. And then no one listens to our plea. And that is why our generation is carrying on this movement, saying if India wants to have a pristine democracy, it must remove the martial law. That's why our work on deepening democracy. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act is a colonial act, which was started in 1942 by the British colonial government to thwart Gandhi's Quit India, to thwart Mahatma Gandhi's Quit India movement. The British left, but the government of India imposed this colonial rule on the indigenous people of Manipur. And this is what we are trying to address every single day.
Really interesting to see how all of this kind of evolves in this particular way. And you mentioned this October 5th New York Times article, actually, and photo essay, which I was quite amazed at the coincidence of us planning to have this conversation. And then that article, which I think for many people was the first time they may have heard of Manipur, but focused on this Nupi Ketal market, the women's market. And so at least in that essay, very much it kind of lines up with what you were saying in terms of the indigenous local activism by women, particularly in that marketplace there, but you gave a richer background for that. So when did, or how did this kind of grassroots movement located in Northeast India then start to become kind of international scale in the type of work that you're doing now?
Yes. The Maira Paibi movement, the women's movement in Manipur, as well as so many other movements, for example, the beautiful Naga Mothers Association, was a brilliant work on peace building, because there are 17 peace talks in northeast of India, and not a single indigenous woman is included in those peace talks, James. Just sink in for a moment. We form half the community, and women face the brunt of many of these struggles. But when it comes to negotiating table, indigenous women of the Northeast are excluded from this. So even in our local parliaments, our local legislative assemblies, there is not a single woman in the Manipur State Assembly today. There's not a single woman in the Nagaland State Assembly today, just one or two. So we continue to face these struggles of patriarchal notions, even in our indigenous communities. And so that remains. But in spite of that, we have such strong, extraordinary women, indigenous women activists. And for our team at Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network and the Northeast Women Initiative for Peace, we realized how important it is, because what is so interesting is this 8 states, which constitutes northeast of India, is connected to New Delhi by flights very easily, okay? But we are not connected to each other. Let us think. So it's this particular northeast of India. For example, if you take out a newspaper in Manipur, you will have half a page of American news, for example, of Kim Kardashian news, but you will not have news of other indigenous communities from Sikkim or from Tripura. It's not there. So in short, there's a way, but while the history of India is made to be studied, and Hindi as a medium of language is literally, we have to learn that. So this superstructure is there in which everyone seems to be connected to New Delhi, capital of India, but not with each other. Our team made a conscious effort, which is really important, stemming from the historical struggles. The follow-up that we did was we organized for the first time a historic women's peace congregation, which we call the Northeast India Women Peace Congregation. It started in 2006, around 15, the first one we did, and then we had another one in 2016 in Imphal as well as in Assam. And then we are going to host the third one on 21st of November 2020, and where we got women from across all the warring groups. As I mentioned, there's a divide and rule policy in the region where people are made to fight with each other because it cannot be controlled by New Delhi. So the colonial divide and rule policy continued, and we have tried to ensure that this goes on. In terms of international footprints, it was a struggle that our team did, actually, together with many, many others. We managed to form alliances with many women groups from around the world. We have a very strong alliance with the Nobel Women Initiative, Jodie Williams, Shirin Ebadi. They have become some of our strongest supporters of our work. Lema Gowi, I've met her before she won the Nobel Peace Prize. We have met them and they have continued to give us. We have met Afghan women, women from Myanmar, women from Palestine, women from around the world, and we have formed the solidarity groups. And on the other hand, we also relied on many of the international mechanisms which are there, particularly the United Nations, for example, the UN Convention on the Rights of Indigenous People. So we work very closely with that. And that's how last year we formed what is known as a Global Alliance of Indigenous People, Gender, Justice, and Peace. So we have now formed alliances with Indigenous women from around the world. Women from Guatemala, women from Mexico, women from North America. So we have women from Indigenous women from Africa. So we are in this. So it is a work that our team worked for almost a decade and a half to reach where we are. And this is the moment that we are in. And we're really thankful for the support that we have got from friends and colleagues from around the world to deepen our work.
I mean, there's an obvious kind of irony in all of this as well when one sees how the kind of alliances that you formed internationally and synergies with other groups has taken off earlier than being able to organize those kind of synergies locally in Northeast India with the different groups that are, where the separations have been strategically implemented to try to drive people apart. And so that, I think that is common to other parts of the region. I know some of your colleagues at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard have been working on some of the similar things inside of Burma, for example, and how different communities there were also driven apart, and the efforts that it takes to try to draw people together and actually trust each other again, build trust locally and build, first of all, trust, and then a sense of being able to work together. That region seems particularly challenging, your region of Northeast India. As you mentioned, I think you, in your opening comments, that there's something like 400 different languages, did I hear you say, that are spoken in? So how does that, in addition to being, structurally kind of separated for political reasons, what is it? What are some of the strategies for being able to unite people then, and even just to foster conversation amongst those different groups?
Yes. Again, this is a fascinating question because it will allow me to share with you and your audience about what is this region actually. So these were, as I mentioned, independent Asiatic nation states, and then the British rule came to Manipur in 1891, as I mentioned, but Britain colonial rule had a very, they didn't overtake everything. They took care of trade and defense, and then the rest where we had our own indigenous rulers were controlling the areas in many parts. So what is interesting in this part of the world is with the British rule came a lot of missionaries So with that education, English education came. So northeast of India, if you ask any Indian, one thing they will say, we many derogatory things, but one thing they will say, we speak good English. I mean, I studied in Little Flower School, which was a Christian convent. But then we also were able to practice our own indigeneity. Nothing was forced on us. So we got the liberal education, and then we continued with our indigenous way of life too. So in the Northeast, if you want your child to go to a good school, you send them to a convent school. So language, actually, English became the lingua franca across.
Okay.
So that's how we are able to connect.
Interesting.
That's one thing that I would say. So that is one thing which binds all of us in terms of our indigeneity first, and second, that English language is spoken across. And we have a very strong. We have parts of Northeast Shillong was the summer capital of British India when Kolkata was the capital since 1911 till 1911. Delhi was not the capital of British India; it was Kolkata. So when Kolkata was a British capital, Shillong in Northeast, where my sister lives, became the summer capital. So it's even the cottages till today is so British. And then the bakery is to die for. It's amazing. So it's very anglicized in many parts. And because of the access to English education, I think people started becoming more aware of the world around, then beyond our own villages, mountain villages. I think the awareness level of many of the political movements in the northeast of India came with this form of education. From there, although there were proselytization going on too, but it also created, opened a whole new world, which is beyond the region. So this is how I would describe in terms of how people got together, in terms of, so this is still a work in progress in terms of, as I mentioned, people are as I mentioned, what is really painful. And I have, after I left physics, I became a historian by training. So I'm trained in subaltern history. So I always look for history of forgotten people and nations. And it was then I realized the history of 45 million indigenous people in what is in the region known as northeast of India is not in the syllabus of India. It's not in the textbooks of India. Let this sink in for a while. That means today, if you hadn't met me, James, if India just wipes all of us, you would even know that we existed. That's why we started a project called Weaving History in Northeast India. I have met the Minister of Human Resource. We have done so many things to tell the government of India, all the education curriculum council members we have met, and tell them, you got to rectify this wrong, you see, because the formative phase of a child's life is, when you're born till when you're like, your mind is formed till the age 8, 9, 10, properly formed, literally, and whatever you learn later is just an add-on. But during that formative stage, if you're not taught that there are indigenous people in India, such as living in northeast of India, how would a young child growing in Delhi and Mumbai, when they see a face like me, for example, how would they know? That's why every time I'm in Delhi, I'm always asked this question, Madam, which country are you from? By a fellow Indian. How do you feel as an American if someone asks you, James, are you American? Every time we have to prove. So we have Indian passports, but the policies in India have not made us feel Indian enough. In fact, I call that we feel like second-class citizens in India. And that's why the whole issue of racism, George Floyd moment, we had a George Floyd moment in the year 2014, when a 19-year-old boy, Nido Tania, from Arunachal Pradesh in northeast of India, was beaten to death in the streets of Delhi. And I, with hundreds and thousands of other students and other young people, we led massive protests in Delhi's Jantar Mantar and got the government of India to form a committee called the Besbero Committee to recognize that racism against the indigenous people of northeast of India happens. So this is the way in which this area has been blanked out from the consciousness of not just the world, forget the world, we are being blanked out from the consciousness of other Indians. So that when an Indian sees a person from Northeast, we are always asked if we are Thai or Filipino or a Nepali. but never an Indian. So in
Yeah.
Indian caste system, if you want to put in the context of Indian caste system, I call that we are not even Dalits, we are outcasts, literally. We are not, so we don't have caste system. Only those who have been married into or some linkages, historical do have some of these linkages of caste, but the northeast of India, indigenous people of northeast India, we don't have the caste system like the rest of India. Our food habits are different. We have more herbs than spices. We don't have chicken tikka masalas, but we have iromba, we have singju, we have kangso, food cooked with a lot of herbs without a drop of oil. And we also a culture of weaving. What I'm wearing is woven by the women of Manipur. We have a very, what I call indigenous economies, very strong indigenous economies, which is anti-Adam Smith, liberal, neoliberal, capitalist economy. We have a very strong indigenous economies in this part of the world, and we continue through those economies across the Northeast.
Yeah. Well, I was so glad that you mentioned Nido Tanya and that incident in 2014, because I would encourage our viewers to take a look at the very interesting op-ed piece you wrote for the Washington Post back in on September 22nd of this year, which I thought was also very timely. And I thought it was quite interesting the way that you related the current skirmishes that are happening between India and China that seem to be ongoing now, where there's just been some flare-ups recently about that, but then also linking it to Northeast India. So I wonder if, for the benefit of our viewers, if you could explain a little bit about how you view that conflict, and how does, at least in the title of your article, you said that the Northeast India is caught in the middle, again, of this, and maybe explain a little bit what you meant by that.
Absolutely. Again, this is a very important question, which will again delve into another dynamics of the Northeast of India, which your viewers would have never thought of. First of all, as I mentioned, the Northeast of India borders China. There is the northern part of Northeast of India called Arunachal Pradesh. This is a place where when the Dalai Lama fled Tibet, he was hiding in our region. And from there, he went to, taken shelter. And now Dharamshala is where many of the Tibetan refugees live. Arunachal Pradesh is still not recognized by China as a part of India. So while the world knows about the Kashmir conflict, the world doesn't know about the conflict which is happening here for more than almost literally like 70 years or so. So the northern part of Northeast of India, China has refused to recognize it as a part of India. So it's so much military in this particular zone. And so number one. Number two is because many of, like in my article in Washington Post, I had also mentioned that in June this year, during the height of COVID, there were 4 to 5 people from Arunachal Pradesh who were picked up by the Chinese military. And it was only after the families contacted and shared through social media, we prevailed upon the politicians of India to then talk to their Chinese counterpart, which resulted in their release in early September after being arrested for months, literally. One of them was even arrested in March this year. So this has been happening. And in the 1960s, there was an Indochina war in which the Chinese military actually came up to the Northeast, and it could have actually cut off the Northeast from the rest of India. But then it was negotiated with, I think, the Aksai Chin territory. So this is a very, very geostrategic part of South Asia and Asia right now. And while a lot of focus, many of the policy analysts, whether in Washington, D.C. or New Delhi, they sit in Washington, D.C. and New Delhi and talk about China and India, while we, the people of Northeast, sit right at the border. But our views have never been taken. And this is why we are saying all these discussions, we are always caught in the middle, but our issues have not been understood in a way. And in fact, the larger geostrategic dynamics is this. One road, one belt policy of China, which I don't know if you have heard, and I think some of your viewers may have heard. is an attempt by the Chinese government to actually control the economy, world's economy through this. And the northeast of India is in a part, one of the roads passes through that. It's a part of their policy. So it is incumbent upon policy analysts to look at what is happening in the Indo-China border in the northeast of India. For me, my personal take is this, that, and this is very interesting, again, new for some of your listeners. I have traveled not just in the northeast of India, all across, but also traveled extensively in Burma, Myanmar. And what is happening? 45 million people in northeast of India, whose history, whose thing are not in the textbook of India, completely neglected. Everyone talks about the Rohingyas, but it is not just the Rohingyas who have been denied citizenship. There are many ethnic minorities in Burma which have been denied citizenship in Myanmar. The world have inflated the Rohingya crisis while ignoring some of the crises happening within Burma against the ethnic communities. And they constitute about 60 million. So I am seeing as an analyst in this region, 45 million and 60 million, 100 million people who, again, the 60 million people in Burma, their history is even not in the textbooks of Yangon. Mm-hmm. So this, what I call Indo-Burma border, northeast spurs the ethnic minorities of Burma, 100 million people. The world has not even started studying us. Mm-hmm. And imagine the release of these 5 Arunachali people from the Chinese government, arrest this time, is a proof of how, if indigenous people of this land, of this area, could prevail upon, it's beyond the nation state's ambit to get them released, but we got through our pressure to get them released. So it's very important that in the geostrategic analysis of this particular region, and particularly for the history of 2 superpowers, China and India, if you do not study this 100 million in this Indo-Burma border, the world and India is missing a complete analysis of what's happening in this region. And this is exactly why in the article in Washington Post, I tried to sort of pierce a little bit. By the way, this is the first ever article on northeast of India that has ever actually appeared on international press. Mm. Because our stories have not been picked up. It is always stories from New Delhi or Mumbai. So we are grateful to them. And again, this is, I had to just do it in 900 words. So it was a very short article, but we plan to follow up with more insightful articles. But again, as I mentioned, beyond the article, the history of 100 million people in the Indo-Burma border needs to be studied by Asia watchers. If not, we're completely missing an analysis of India-China if we do not include the people of Northeast and the ethnic minorities in Myanmar. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you very much. So I wonder, given the statement in your article in the Washington Post and now your affiliation with the Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard, I wonder if you could say a little bit about, even though this is obviously a somewhat irregular year of being unable to be present on campus and do things in person, and the kind of normal sorts of events that we have in a very active year at Harvard, which is lots of symposia, talks, and things like that, which I wish we could have for you. But what are some of the things you hope to accomplish this year while you're a fellow at the Carr Center?
Absolutely. I'm so grateful to the Carr Center and those who have supported me to be here, to be able to do my work. It has not been easy for us, for the indigenous people of Manipur and Northeast, to leave our home regions, and so it's a dream come true for many of us. So when I am here at the Carr Center and working with many, many amazing people, for us, this is an opportunity of a lifetime. And so we plan to do 2 things. One is to understand, first of all, to enable the people at Harvard, as well as those who are affiliates, to know the story of what's happening in this forgotten world, part of the world. We have over 29 active conflicts in the world, which are reported and studied and analyzed, but there are 300 plus unreported conflict zones in the world. And the conflict in Manipur is one of them. So during my time at CAR Center, I plan to work with those who are looking in the areas of conflict and peace and war to let them know that there are these other forgotten, unreported war zones, which they got to include in the analysis. The kind of research that I'm seeing here is a very top-down research where you have access to, for example, 300 cases and you analyze it in a data set and then you form your analysis. We come from an opposite lens. Mm-hmm. So I thought it'll be very interesting during my time at Harvard to be able to see how we can fuse these two together. Mm-hmm. So I'm at the political violence workshop. I'm at trying to look at the nonviolence incubation lab at the CAR Center, as well as those who are looking at armed conflict, just to see how they are like analyzing some forgotten conflict zones, number one. Mm-hmm. Number two is to also try to build, how do we look at building a global alliance? As I said, we started this in last year, and we want to see how we can build a global indigenous movement and incubate ideas of indigenous conflict resolution and peacemaking. This has not been done before. So this is indigenous peacemaking beyond nation states. And this is the new idea that we're bringing in, which we plan to incubate during my time. And then, so these are the couple of things that we plan to do during this short time. And with the pandemic, everything is online, but we, the indigenous people, for us, as long as the spirit is there, we can undertake any kind of like work. So yes, it is a painful time in global history to have this pandemic. It has affected every single home in the world, literally. Mm-hmm. But we continue to stay safe, continue to help others. We continue to be compassionate and continue to do our research and activism and our advocacy wherever we are.
I mean, one of the interesting, again, kind of issues that's come up with the COVID pandemic and the effect on higher education and all the things that we do at the university is that, yes, we've lost that kind of local connectivity around the university and what's happening there, but it's also opened up kind of networks at a much larger level, both nationally and internationally, where we can connect this way through a call like this and bring in people that normally couldn't have been part of those conversations, say at Harvard. So for us, and particularly our role at the Asia Center, the ability to draw on you and your expertise, and also help in whatever ways we can to connect you to other synergies that we know through our connections. This for us was, I think, a really important thing, was to be able to hear your history, to hear you telling the story of this region, and not just, I mean, for the region itself and its history, but also, as you just said, in terms of the types of initiatives that you're linking up with at the CAR Center. I know one of my colleagues over there that we drew on last year during the large protests that were happening in Hong Kong, Professor Erica Chenoweth, who I'm sure you know, and really showing the value and the actual efficacy and success of maintaining nonviolent protests. So your work in terms of disarmament and remaining as a peaceful, nonviolent movement and form of activism, I think is another testament to show how those movements tend to be far more successful than armed uprisings and things like that. And so it seems like a really rich kind of coming together of, as you said, larger kind of theoretical or methodological thinking on these topics, but then your ability to bring this kind of from the ground sort of up perspective, really rooted in the grassroots organizations of Northeast India.
Yes. So there are two elements to it. So we are trying to see how we can incubate these ideas, but at the same time, I think this would be my plea to the Asia Center, like the historiography of these 100 million people in this Indo-Burma border. It's non-existent. I have looked at records and I'm wondering why has such a huge part of this Asiatic world completely locked out? And is it because we have been made, we were never borders, we were nation states. But because the colonial borders then drew, for example, we have more than 30 villages, Manipuri villages in Burma till today. So the borders were drawn in a very erroneous way, which have divided communities and our own people. So the borderline of colonial rule has made many of these Asiatic border regions, as we know now, has been completely left out from the map of research, analysis, and writing. So on one hand, our work on nonviolent movement, disarmament steps from trying to find justice and peace and dignity to this 70-year-old armed conflict. And how do we bring the government of India, world's largest democracy, to recognize the efforts of the people in the region to find solutions, number one. On the other hand, we need, and for me, I'm talking now as a historian, is how do we then also document in a proper research way so that this area can become part of a global Asiatic study. So that's one thing that I am invested in. And because time is so short at the Carr Center, so I plan to then, once I get another opportunity to be able to deepen the work, working with scholars such as yourself, Anisha, on how can we create this historiography, how we can create a sort of narrative of history which has been completely left out from the historiography of the world and of Asia. So that's something which I'm really, really excited about and hope one day we can do something about it. Third, centers like yourself to take a look at areas.
I mean, this falls exactly into the type of kind of mission of what the Asia Center is really all about, and in terms of working across these types of boundaries and working in a transnational context. And as you know, the history of kind of area studies in higher education, at least in the U.S., is the way that has operated has it's often created boundaries more than anything else, and areas of specialization, and the types of boundaries that have traditionally been operated with, whether you think of East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on, that those often inhibit the types of work that you're discussing. And one of the areas, because as we know, those divisions and those boundaries just are not applicable when one looks at the local level and realizes that there have been communications across these regions for a very, very long period of time. So one can look to the ocean areas or water connections, and then one can also look at land movements, and particularly that area of Northeast India, as we said, surrounded in this nexus that connects really literally East Asia on the China side to South Asia, India side, to Southeast Asia on the Burma side. So this is, it's really a great example of the sort of problems that the traditional carving up of the world in terms of area studies has created certain blind spots, but it also provides the opportunity to think across those lines now. And that's one of the real, I think, one of the strong missions right now of the Asia Center, particularly in regard to bringing Southeast Asia into the picture, which is something at Harvard hasn't had as strong of a profile as, say, its work on East and South Asia. So we're really trying to enhance that. I think this conversation with you today has helped to sort of show the necessity of those ties. But even beyond that, just to say thank you so much for the insight, and think of this as the beginning of a conversation of opening up the history and the culture of this region, which is so fascinating. But also as an introduction to the very important work that you're doing, both as a historian, but also as an activist trying to deal with a situation that has long, deep roots to it, and will probably have equally difficult solutions to try to bring peace to such a beautiful and ethnically rich, linguistically rich, culturally rich area that it is always striking how sad it is that some of the most beautiful parts of our world tend to be mired in these kinds of conflicts in ways that just seem somehow discordant with the beauty that they're captured within. So thank you very much again for joining me, Dina, and I hope that we can carry on this conversation and perhaps do something else in the future with the Asia Center during your time, even though we're separated physically, that we can at least draw on you again and perhaps present another topic on Manipur.
Thank you so much, James, and to you and the Asia Center for welcoming us and listening to our story and our struggles. And this, I feel, is a beginning of many more years of work. And I'm grateful because we have been trying so hard to tell our stories to the world. We have been blocked many times, even blocked at the United Nations. But the world must listen to stories like us because it'll make the world a much richer place to understand what's happening, particularly in these so-called border areas, which have been completely neglected for like decades, for literally half a century. So thank you for bringing this story and listening to the story of Manipur and northeast of India today.
It's completely our pleasure. So thank you again, Meena.